Thank you to UNIN for these webinars and for incorporating the UNSSC in your planning. It's been a pleasure for us to be presenting the toolkit. So let me move on. We'll get into the session today. Before I do that, some of you will have seen this. I know that at least 4 of you will have seen this before, but I did want to highlight at this time of the COVID crisis a UNSSC learning opportunity that has been developed and is being made freely available to all staff within the UN system at this web address here. And this is a free online tool that you are able to sign up for, and it has learning around the UN System Leadership Framework, managing emotions, systems thinking, an introduction to change management, building resilience, introduction to innovation, and then leading through communication. All learning interventions that have been designed by the Staff College in what is called our Blue Line Online learning portfolio. But this UN Leadership in Times of Uncertainty course, as I say, available to all staff freely until the end of May, made available by the Staff College here in Turin at this time of crisis as a service to the system. Now let's focus on the toolkit, un-innovation.tools/register. As Johanna has mentioned, this is a free resource. This also is open to anybody within the system, and in fact, as many of you have heard me say before, even those outside the system are able to use this. There is a drop-down link for them in the registration process, but this is a free resource regardless of level, regardless of location, duty station, scope of job, whatever it is. This is available to you so that we are, as a system, able to start discussing and start working on what is innovation, what does it mean to us, and how can we work to do things differently and do different things. As indicated beforehand, the UN Innovation Toolkit was developed by the UN for the UN, and for some of the background on that, please do see the first webinar in this series. But basically, it was incorporated so that we were able to speak the same language. We were able to understand that the case studies that were being presented, the models that were being presented, had been iterated within the system and had been analyzed and evaluated within the system as well. So the United Nations Innovation Network was critical to the development of that. UNIN and its members was critical to the development of the toolkit and to the design of the case studies. So of course we are all indebted to them. From the Staff College point of view, as has been indicated by Johanna, we are working on more models around the toolkit, building learning around the toolkit and case studies as well. But we will be making announcements on our website and of course sharing that with UNIN as we move on in the future. The toolkit, for those of you who have not engaged, one of the key elements of it is an online diagnostic tool which has 27 questions, which allows you to start discussing from the perspective of your team, your unit, or your organization, your readiness to innovate. And then you are given feedback as to which of these 5 modules that we have been discussing in the webinars, how ready you are to innovate within each of those. Now, the great thing about the toolkit is that it records this data, and this acts as a baseline so that you are able to design and deliver and implement interventions around innovation. You're able to then come back to the diagnostic and track any change so that you can evaluate, so that you can judge the success or otherwise of that intervention. And as we had discussed last week when we were examining the culture element of the toolkit, it is important for us to acknowledge and research failures even within the projects that we try, projects that we enact, something that, as we all would, I think, acknowledge, the UN has historically been fairly poor at, but is something that is critical for us to learn and critical for us to be able to share insight and experience across agencies and to learn. Now, as I have shown here, the actionable tools, the tools that are indicated and highlighted and used in the toolkit are structured around what are called modules, and I have covered each of those modules to date. The strategy, partnerships, architecture, and culture. Strategy, we examined the innovation planner tool. Partnerships, we looked at defining a value proposition. Architecture, focusing on user-centered design. And as I just mentioned last week, the culture session examined embracing failures. And today we finish up with evaluation And you'll see, of course, there the acronym SPACE developed, which ties in and explains a lot of the little rockets and moons and planets and astronauts that you will see throughout the toolkit. Now, in regards to the evaluation tools that are incorporated, you can see here evaluation is the tools that have been developed: innovation storytelling, stage to gate assessment, a life cycle analysis, and enabling environmental scanning of your innovation interventions, of your innovative ideas. And today we'll be focusing on innovation storytelling. The reason that we have selected innovation storytelling is simply because this is the most popular tool that has been recommended by the diagnostic element of the toolkit, indicating that there is the greatest relevance and the greatest need for this across the system. Now, I do want to highlight here, now I come from an instructional design and an adult learning background, and so for me, evaluation has a different meaning and a different focus, and I think that Johanna also indicated this at the start of this session as well, very well. But I want to highlight that evaluation in the context of this module, in the context of this toolkit, is structured as the evaluation of innovation processes at both a project and a portfolio level. So really analyzing how relevant were these, did they work, did they not work, and how do we share information around this, as well as an assessment as to whether entities are fostering an environment that supports innovation more broadly. So really focusing on not only what are we doing at a project and a portfolio level, but how are we as an entity, as a team unit or an organization, how are we structuring and fostering this enabling environment? So the evaluation is focused around those processes rather than a strict monitoring and evaluation approach. We need to understand before we begin and before we discuss evaluation is that innovation, as you all know, is a dynamic, iterative process, and we discussed that last week when we were talking about culture, we were talking about failure. We also need to understand that evaluation can also be difficult based on this dynamic process. Effective evaluation helps us to, and this is what was highlighted by Johanna, helps us to identify opportunities to improve innovation, allocate resources more effectively, and also demonstrate value to decision makers. And this is part of this definition of evaluation as has been adopted in the toolkit, and certainly relates very heavily to this tool of innovation storytelling. So innovation storytelling helps us to select the right types of communication approaches for various stakeholders so that we are able to both gain buy-in as well as to make more strategic decisions. And you'll see linkages between this tool and the partnership development tools, for example, that we had discussed earlier on in this webinar series. But I do want to stress once again that all of the tools have been developed to be used in isolation. They can be used, there is a structured process, there is a worksheet with all of the tools that you are able to download, which outlines all of the steps incorporated into this, into the tool. There is also a worksheet that you are able to download so that you are able to have these conversations with your teams, your units, or your organizations. And so it does that they can be used and they are designed to be used in isolation. Having said that, there are parallels between the tools and the discussions and insight that is gained from this tool, for example, which can be highlighted and can be really brought into sharper relief when examining and using the partnership development tools, for example. So we need to be asking ourselves, what is innovation? We need to be able to share that with our stakeholders, with those decision makers who will allow us to move forward. So we need to be outlining what is innovation, what does it mean for us, why does it matter, and what difference can this innovation make? And even when we start examining, for example, those two last elements on this slide, we can really start to understand that the communication of this is going to differ depending on who that stakeholder is. How can they receive this information? What are their specific interests in this innovation process that are going to be piqued, that are going to be the hooks that we can communicate to them so that they give us more buy-in, so that they will allow us to move ahead. So when we talk about innovation storytelling, we need to sit with our team, we need to sit with our unit, we need to sit and consider our stakeholders, and we need to think about how do we communicate effectively so that we can resonate with these audiences that we've identified. How do we draw attention to our innovative idea? Our idea is not going to be the only innovative idea perhaps in this space. So how is it that we can communicate, that we can evaluate, that we can share insight and lessons learned so that we are the most relevant and the most attractive to decision makers, and often, crucially, to time-starved decision makers? How can we communicate effectively? How can we capture sustained interest when we do have decision makers and we do have stakeholders who have limited time to engage with us, perhaps who are busy, particularly now when we think about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis around the world? How is it that we can sustain interest when we are sharing the evaluations, sharing the stories of our innovation intervention? How can we increase stakeholder support? How can we increase stakeholder buy-in? How can we increase stakeholder excitement? We want people to be attracted, not just here, but we want people to be attracted from an emotional level as well. How can we work to communicate targeted value, success, and relevance? And let's just examine those three elements for a moment. Those are going to be very, very different depending on the stakeholder that we are communicating with. If it is an internal stakeholder, what are we talking about when we talk about value? Is it money saved? Is it money earned? Is it impact? Is it targeted impact? What is this definition of value that we are using when we are discussing and engaging and sharing with stakeholders? And how does that differ with different stakeholders, particularly when we think about internal and external stakeholders? Similarly, also, the terminology, the definition of success, the definition of relevance will differ as well. And this toolkit does allow us, step by step, to undertake those discussions with our groups, with our teams, our units, and where possible with our organizations, so that we are able to target innovation storytelling more. The 4 steps incorporated into the tool: to develop a compelling theme for your story, to identify your audience and its unique characteristics, to choose the appropriate storytelling method and channel, and then to determine the frequency of communication. So let's go a little bit deeper into that. Step 1, develop a compelling theme for your story. So it's a process of sitting down, and again, there are worksheets incorporated into the tool. This is a step-by-step process that the toolkit guides you through. But you need to be sitting and working with your team or your unit or your stakeholders to outline a goal for the sentiment or the conclusion that you want your audience to walk away with it. How do you want your audience to feel when you have communicated your evaluation of your innovative intervention? You need to focus on impact. And again, impact can be different depending on the stakeholder with whom we are communicating. What is the value? What is the positive change? How did you make life different for a person, for a family? At this stage, statistics are important. At this stage, the overarching discussion is important. But when we're looking at hooking people, when we're looking at connecting with people, we need to focus on how did our innovation intervention change lives? Is there a story and a focus of one person, one family, one stakeholder, one beneficiary that we can use to share, that we can use to highlight this impact? Draw on emotion. How does this improve lives? As I say, those two clearly very, very linked. And differentiate. What did we do that was new? What did we do that was different? And why is it that we are the ones that should push this forward? Why is it that we are the ones that should be accepted as we move forward by these stakeholders and these decision makers? There are outlines in the tool as to how do we work to highlight partner successes. This is critical when we talk about partnerships, and again, this relates back to the partnership tools. But we are all, if we have even a look at the UN System Leadership Framework, we are all compelled to work more heavily on co-creation. And so how is it that we can really highlight the successes of our partner so that we also benefit from that highlighting of that process? We create these vignettes, these stories. How do we develop real-life examples of impact on the day-to-day, again, coming back to my previous comment about the day-to-day changes that your innovation intervention has allowed for. How are people's lives different now than before, and how can you scale that? We work to also spotlight the risk takers. So we need to work out who has been willing to take a chance, a measured chance, and this ties back to the discussions we had in the last session around failure, but also identifying who was it that was willing to take these chances, how did they pan out, how was the planning around that, and how can we look to scale this type of risk-taking. We need to promote persistence. We need to understand and highlight to our stakeholders and decision makers we're trying to communicate with that this didn't happen overnight. This was a journey. We need to be thinking and reflecting as a team, evaluating as a team, as a unit, as an organization. How did we grow? What did we learn? Relating back to last week, relating back to this focus on failure. What did we learn positively and negatively? And how can we incorporate that into our decision-making processes, our planning processes as we move forward? So we need to show to these decision makers as we are sharing this evaluation, as we are telling the story of our innovation, what was our journey like? How can this be replicated? How do we grow? How do we change? We also need to work towards leading the pack. How were we innovative? How were we identifying new trends? How were we incorporating new technologies? How can we also incorporate opportunities that are on the horizon? And critically now, I mean, realistically, with the changes that we can see in the system since the COVID-19 crisis, I think that this is a critical time for us to be able to share how we have led the pack, how we have identified and utilized new trends or new technologies. Now I'm going to introduce now the action outline. Now the action outline, for those of you who have been part of this process before, is the case study that is incorporated into each of the tools, so that you are able to see the proposed structure of the tool, the process of the tool reflected in the worksheet which is completed there. And this is the worksheet which is also downloadable for you to engage with your team or your unit. So within the innovation storytelling tool, we have an action outline, which is an organization focusing its story around a highly successful mobile app to connect refugees to basic services and the need for additional funding to allow for scaling. So this organization, they have developed an app which has connected refugees to basic services, and now they are evaluating that, they are reflecting on that, and they are pushing towards the need for additional funding to allow for scaling. So using this innovation storytelling tool, and I acknowledge that the text is a little bit hard to read here, but this is from the toolkit, which is available, as I say, freely to you at un-innovation.tools. Outlining in one sentence what they're hoping to achieve through this communication. So we can see there that this group has engaged internally and identified that they want to be getting across that their organization had significant success with a pilot app connecting refugees to humanitarian and legal services, and that they are looking for additional support to continue scaling this. The key points that they've identified is that A, there was initial skepticism, and you can see here it's on this key points element here, that there was initial skepticism among public and donors. However, they formed a highly productive partnership. Remember, we talked about highlighting partners. And in the pilot refugee camp, they saw widespread adoption. So this is the success that they wish to share. They've outlined why that was. They've engaged with existing technology. They've shown the impact of this. So really, you can see within that key points element, they are reflecting and evaluating what led to success at this stage. The supporting point of interest, they're showing that there is smartphone penetration amongst the refugees. They have rates of adoption for the app. They can show a % decrease in the processing time for asylum cases. They can show an increase in humanitarian aid disbursement, and all of these elements that they have identified here. Now, when we think about how we are sharing our story, how we are storytelling around our innovation, you can see here that these key points of interest will be relevant to different stakeholders. And so the promotion of these elements will differ in their communication practices as they move ahead. Step 2, identify your audience and its unique characteristics. So Realistically, the structure here, the process here is not only to identify, but also to prioritize how you will engage with them, how often you will engage with them. And within the tool, stakeholders are typically identified as falling within 5 categories: leadership, colleagues, partners, both internal and external. And that's a crucial definition to make and to discuss: beneficiaries and naysayers. Now, critically, as I mentioned last week, when we're talking about stakeholders, we can't simply be happy, we can't be satisfied by simply saying, for example, Ministry of Finance. We need to understand which elements of that ministry and why they are important to us, so that when we are targeting that communication, we can better understand how we can get that communication to them, how they receive communication, and how they will use that communication. And until we do an analysis like that, we are unable to really target the communication practices that we are designing and delivering. We need to be considering, what is the seniority level of our stakeholder? Do we have a regular engagement with them? Are we communicating with them formally? Are we communicating with them informally? How do they receive this information? Is it data-driven? Is it story-driven? Are people more likely to be using data to then feed that into their own reporting statistical requirements? Or are they looking for more stories so that they can share that online? They can share that in blog posts, for example. We need to think, are these people learning visually, verbally, auditorily? What is their age range? We need to think about how we would communicate. The way I communicate with some of the more senior staff, even within the college, differs very much from those from the younger generation within the college. How big is this group of stakeholders? What is their level of interest? What is their level of engagement? And that ties also into this next step of how often we communicate with them. If they are simply happy to be informed, then you will be having to communicate less often than if they have a deep buy-in to the program. We need to consider whether there are structural constraints, access to technology, for example, that would impact the type of communication. I worked with stakeholders in my previous role, whereby they were only able to accept 2 attachments to any email, and those attachments could be no bigger than 2 megabytes. They never told us this. So we had to understand, we had to work out how it was that we could get communication to them effectively. And of course, that differed from other stakeholders. We need to think about the language that is being used by our stakeholders. If we have a look at this action piece here as well, this again is the tool that is outlined within the toolkit, so that you are able to discuss with your team, discuss with your unit, and identify who are the stakeholders, what are the characteristics, and then how are we going to actively engage and share stories about our innovation with them. Step 3, choose the appropriate storytelling method and channel in the context of this toolkit. The method is the format in which you are telling the story. The channel is how you will be distributing the story, and with that regard here also is some more focus from the tool itself. So the method here, perhaps an infographic, which might be used more appropriately, or it's appropriate for almost all audiences. May want to use it as a supplement for more senior groups. So more senior groups may wish to have more detailed information accompanied by the infographic. And then you can see some case studies here as well. Comic or an illustration, an article or a blog. At the Staff College, we use a large number of blogs because we are sharing on social media. We are incorporating from the blog, from the formal reporting, we are incorporating elements into the blog. So there is a reduction of the duplication of development of materials as we storytell. And then there are these written reports, which of course is a more traditional way of engagement, and then the potential of videos as well. Again, all of these elements available within the tool itself, so that you are able to discuss with your teams and your units, how can we design and develop this evaluation information, and then how can we share this with our stakeholders. Meetings, presentations, and immersive experience as well. Again, all information that is available within the tool. We need to then discuss how often do we share this information? How much is too much? How much is too little? As I mentioned before, in your stakeholder analysis, you will be identifying If people simply have a vague interest and just simply wish to be kept informed about your innovation, the amount of times, the amount of engagement you have with them is going to differ from somebody who has a lot of influence and a lot of interest on your innovation tool, on your innovation intervention, or on its scaling up as well. As we can see here, some 40% of innovative organizations provide stakeholder updates monthly, 30% provide it quarterly. The case study that is incorporated in the tool, as a matter of course within the tool, is focused on the UNICEF Vanuatu drone corridor, and there are some critical questions in here, which is a great checklist, which I will leave you with, which is realistically answering, is our communication simple? That is critical when we're trying to get our story across. Does it clearly show result or impact? Is there a human element? Again, how did this change lives? Does it connect to a global issue or challenge that's relevant to UNICEF? Is it actionable? And when our stakeholders ask, what next? Is our communication incorporating that when we are discussing our innovation intervention and how we move ahead? That is the address for me at the UNSSC. I have also copied the address of the toolkit there again for you, and I am available for questions if you wish, understanding that that is the time that we had advertised for the session. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you again to Yunan and particularly, of course, Johanna, for working with us to design this and for allowing us to take part.